Welcome to Sacred Heart University's Center for Catholic Studies Speaker Series. The Center for Catholic Studies promotes innovative and cutting-edge programs that demonstrate Sacred Heart University's mission rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition as a living reality related to our lives and in the world in which we live. Join us now live from the campus of Sacred Heart University with our host, Dr. Jillian Plummer.
Welcome to the Center for Catholic Studies Speaker Series and the Human Journey Colloquia. I am Professor Plummer and I will be your host today. Sacred Heart University's Center for Catholic Studies presents innovative and cutting-edge programs that demonstrate Sacred Heart University's mission, rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition, as an ongoing, living conversation led by great thinkers in the Catholic tradition, speaking about important issues in our world today. Our series this spring features nationally and internationally renowned speakers who will focus on issues of social, racial, and environmental justice. For our program today, I am honored to present Father James Martin, who will be speaking on the relationship between the Church and the LGBTQ community in his talk entitled, Building a Bridge, Reaching Out to LGBTQ Catholics. Father Martin is a Jesuit priest, author, and editor-at-large at American Media, but his most recent job titles don't really do him justice. He is also what I might call a Catholic celebrity. You might recognize Martin from his recent appearance in February of this year on the Colbert Report, where he promoted his latest book, Learning to Pray, A Guide for Everyone. Or perhaps you remember Martin from his appearance alongside Sister Simone Campbell at the 2020 Democratic National Convention, praying for the poor and the marginalized. It's likely you have also seen Father Martin promoting justice on social media, or even heard him in one of our major national or international news outlets like NPR, PBS, or even the BBC. But today, I'm especially thrilled to welcome Father Martin as an inspiring author, a dear friend and alumnus of the university, and a model for social justice. Before Father Martin joined the Society of Jesus, he earned his undergraduate degree in economics from Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business and spent 6 years working for General Electric in New York City and in Stamford, Connecticut. In 1988, Father Martin entered the Jesuit novitiate. And after joining the Jesuits, Father Martin went on to study philosophy at Loyola University of Chicago and earned his master's degree in divinity and his master's in theology from what is now known as Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry, located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As he earned these degrees, Father Martin also dedicated his time to service. He worked in hospice centers, comforting the seriously ill and dying in Boston, Massachusetts, and in Kingston, Jamaica. While studying philosophy, Martin worked with street gang members in Chicago housing projects and with refugees in Nairobi, Kenya. During his time in East Africa, he also helped found a refugee handicraft shop called the Mikono Center. While he lived in Boston, Father Martin worked as a prison chaplain. And over the course of this fascinating life, Father Martin also became a New York Times best-selling author and prolific writer. In fact, he's written so many books, I will only mention a few. In 2011, Martin published Between Heaven and Mirth, Why Joy, Humor, and Laughter Are at the Heart of the Spiritual Life, which was named by Publishers Weekly as one of the best books of that same year. Martin's The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, A Spirituality for Real Life, which was published a year earlier, is one of my personal favorites that I would recommend to any college student on this broadcast. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the most significant book for our purposes here today, Building a Bridge, How the Catholic Church and the LGBTQ community can enter into a relationship of respect, compassion, and sensitivity, first published in 2017. After the publication of this book, Pope Francis even met with Father Martin to discuss his outreach to LGBTQ persons and LGBTQ Catholics in particular. For all of our students watching, Father Martin truly models the values of the Catholic intellectual tradition we discuss frequently here at Sacred Heart, including our charges to build a more just society and to pursue the truth through scholarship. It is no surprise then that Father Martin has been a guest speaker at SHU many times. Most recently, he visited SHU 2 years ago when he also spoke on the relationship between the church and the LGBTQ community. And he wanted me especially to remind you that he received his honorary degree in 2010 from Sacred Heart University. We are so very delighted and honored to have him, our dear friend, here with us again. Please join me in welcoming Father James Martin.
Thank you so much, Professor. It is wonderful to be back, even though I'm not on campus. I really do feel at home at Sacred Heart. I'm very proud to be an alumnus and have gotten that honorary degree. I think it's such a wonderful thing to be part of your community. And for those of you who may not be on campus, I want to welcome you to this talk. I'm also, as you know, very familiar with the area, having lived in Stamford, Connecticut, right before I entered the Jesuits. So that's where I was, you can say, when I heard the call. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about building a bridge, as Professor was saying, between the Catholic Church and the LGBT community, which is the title of the book that I did in 2017. And I want us to look at specifically, especially since we're talking about the Catholic intellectual tradition, and I'm happy to be talking to students from that course. I want to talk about how the church can build a bridge with Catholic colleges and universities, and essentially what Catholic colleges and universities, which are part of the church, can do to welcome LGBTQ students and faculty. And so to talk about that intellectual tradition, right, vis-a-vis the LGBTQ person. So I'll talk for a little bit, maybe about a half an hour. I don't want to go on too long. And then I'm much more interested in your questions. So I want to start with a story. And it's about a woman named Khadija. Okay, that's not her real name. I've changed some details of the story, but the story itself is essentially true. She was a student from Africa who attended a Catholic college in the United States. I won't say which one. Though she is Muslim, Khadija was involved in her school's campus ministry program and was very excited to go on her first Kairos retreat during senior year, and that's a popular student retreat. While on the retreat, Khadija came out as a lesbian for the first time in her life, and she shared her fears that her family back home would reject her as a result. A few weeks later, before final exams, Khadija contemplated suicide. Fortunately, she felt supported enough during the retreat that she reached out to campus ministry and a theology professor at her school. The campus ministers accompanied her to the emergency room. The theology professor helped her navigate the academic work that she would miss during her hospitalization. And the college's counseling center coordinated treatment with the hospital. In the aftermath, as much as they could, campus ministry continued to be Khadija's family since she really had none in the country. And everyone worked to make sure that she was not alone during the upcoming Christmas holidays. That's an example of how a Catholic college can care for an LGBT person. And it kind of serves as a little bit of a parable for us, right? We remember that parables are the stories that Jesus told. And this is a true story, though disguised in identity. And parables always raise questions for us. So here are a few questions. Would all Catholic colleges have done the same? Would all campus ministry teams have been as welcoming to her coming out? Would all faculty members have known what to do? Would all staff members have understood Khadija's unique situation? Let's go further. Would all Catholic colleges have afforded her such acceptance, even if there weren't a suicide crisis that was presenting itself? Would all have followed the catechism of the Catholic Church, which asks us to treat LGBT people with respect, compassion, and sensitivity? Would all have reached out to her as Jesus asks us to do, with love, mercy, and compassion? In short, would all Catholic colleges have loved her as an LGBT person? Okay, so let's talk about that today. How, in terms of the Catholic intellectual tradition, right? Because it's not just about theory, right, which is important in the intellectual tradition, but also practice, right? Part of the Catholic intellectual tradition is embodied in Catholic colleges and universities. So, given the importance of this topic, and in addition to relying on my own experience and conversations with people in the past, I contacted for this talk Catholic college and university presidents, administration, faculty, staff, students, and trustees to ask for their insights. So what I'm going to talk about and present to you today in brief is not simply based on my own reflections, but the shared wisdom of many people affected by this issue who work both in academia and in the church. So, how can Catholic colleges respond to the needs of LGBT people? It's often a very contentious topic, but it really doesn't have to be, because at the heart of it is what's something that we Jesuits, I'm a Jesuit, call in Latin cora personalis. Cora personalis means care for the whole person, right? So not just care for Khadija as a student, right? Like as a brain, basically, or as a mind, but care for the whole person, her whole self. The primary question for Catholic colleges and Catholic higher ed in general, then, is not a legal one, an ecclesiastical one, a financial one, or even an academic one. It is a spiritual one. How to best care for people who have probably doubted at some point that they are loved by God. They may have feared that their parents or their families would reject them. They may have questioned at some point whether they could find a place in the world. And if they're Catholic, they've certainly doubted or despaired about their own place in the church. And because of these things, may have contemplated suicide or self-harm. Now, look, this is very important to say, and I'm sure there's a lot of people on this this talk who are LGBT. They shouldn't be only seen as victims, obviously, right? We don't want to just have them categorized as victims. They bring joy, energy, and life to our world, our church, and our campuses. They are God's beloved children, created in the image of God, and they bring unique blessings, talents, and graces to the community, to like the Sacred Heart community, precisely as LGBTQ people. By the way, I'm using LGBT. That's the term I'm most familiar with, but it's LGBTQ, LGBTQIA plus. So, substitute in your own mind whatever term you find comfortable. The one I use mostly is LGBT or LGBTQ. So when you encounter an LGBT person or an LGBTQ person, your starting point must be, even though they are gifted and alive with the Spirit, that you are meeting someone who has suffered and may still be suffering. Okay, so I think that's important to say. So I'd invite you to see LGBT people as gifted and graced people who are also in the need of our care, right? In Catholic higher ed, our care, our support, and our advocacy. But how to support, care, and advocate for them. So once again, drawing on the insights of leaders in higher ed, let me share just a few best practices when it comes to building that bridge between the LGBT person and Catholic colleges and universities. Number one, begin with the God-given dignity of the human person. That's just fundamental to me. One college dean at a university on the East Coast, so I'm going to quote some people because I think it's important to bring in these voices of really experienced people. One dean said, quote, "Catholic colleges and universities should be at the forefront of affirming the humanity and dignity of their LGBTQ members, including students, faculty, alumni, and others associated with the institution. All else flows from this: theological reflection, moral judgment, discernment of how to respond to their needs. Concrete measures flow from this too." So these measures dovetail with the Catechism's call for respect, compassion, and sensitivity, right? The Catechism of the Catholic Church asks us, which means it asks Catholic institutions, Catholic higher ed, to treat people with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. So calling people by the names and pronouns that they choose is part of respect. Promoting LGBT inclusive benefits is part of compassion. Including sexual orientation and gender identity in non-discrimination policies shows sensitivity. Okay. A faculty member at another college in the Northeast said that simply acknowledging their presence and their contributions is important. She said, quote, "It is remarkably rare for those in leadership positions within Catholic institutions to positively identify LGBTQ plus people within their communities. Indeed, in a lot of Catholic settings, LGBTQ people may have never heard of themselves spoken in anything other than a negative sense. So begin with their dignity. They should be cared for not because they are Catholic or not Catholic, but because we are Catholic." Even in the face of opposition, sometimes from online campaigns, which can be very destructive and hateful, but even in some cases, donors and trustees and sometimes parents, Catholic schools should be known for their acceptance of LGBT people as a visible sign of how much we value their God-given dignity. Number two, in terms of insights, Never forget how much LGBT people have suffered. A few facts, only a year or so old, may give us some context. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth contemplate suicide at almost 3 times the rate as straight youth. That's pretty extraordinary. And they are almost 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide. So 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide as their straight counterparts. 40% of transgender adults have considered suicide. That's an extraordinary number. And of those, particularly important for Catholic higher ed, and also for you students to know this, of those transgender adults who have considered suicide, 92% did so before they were 25. So in many situations, we have to remember, in terms of, again, the Catholic intellectual and theological tradition, that LGBT issues are often life issues, right? They're life issues, life and death. So let's also consider harassment. According to one study, 85% of LGBT students, that's between 8 and 18, have experienced verbal harassment. 58% of LGBT youth have felt unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation. 43% have felt unsafe because of their gender identity. And it's even worse for transgender students. 54% report being verbally harassed. 24% physically attacked. 17% reported leaving school because the treatment was so bad. And that's to say nothing about families, right? 40% of homeless youth served by services identify as LGBT. Okay. So one of the reasons is because, they're often rejected by their families for religious reasons. Now consider how LGBT people are sometimes treated in the church. Every day I receive messages, sometimes 2 and 3 messages from LGBT people recounting rejection, insults, and persecution from the church's ministers, from their own church. One woman told me that when she came out at her college, the priest in campus ministry said, "I've prayed my whole life never to meet a gay person." Can you believe that? That's a quote. And we've not even talked about the undercurrent of conversion therapy that runs through our church like a polluted stream. Conversion therapy is, this idea that you can change someone into being straight. Thoroughly discredited by psychiatrists and psychologists, banned in many places for the havoc it wreaks on people, it is still used, promoted, and praised in subtle and not so subtle ways in many dioceses, parishes, and schools. Judging from recent conversations I've had, it is also still taught and supported in seminaries. All this compounds the suffering of the LGBT Catholic. So remember, when you're dealing with an LGBT person, Catholic or non-Catholic, you're dealing with people that have probably suffered and struggled a lot. Third insight, welcome LGBT or best practices. Welcome LGBT youth groups, programs, and centers. As a Catholic college, like Sacred Heart, a Catholic community, we need to be clear about our welcome. One faculty member at a Midwestern university said, and by the way, these are all Catholic schools I talked to, said that an LGBT outreach group should be, I love this expression, should be the floor, not the ceiling, right? It should be the baseline, not what we aim to. Almost everyone mentioned this. The recently retired president of a university in the Northeast said, "It's important to facilitate the formation of an LGBT support group. It's important for gay students to know that they're not alone, that there are others like them on campus, and for them to support the community, for them to form a support community." He also rejected the idea, very popular, that these groups are usually out to challenge church teaching. And he's right. They are much more interested, he said, in mutual support and community building. Okay, why not afford them the same respect that colleges do for other groups? The dean of student development in a college in the Northeast said, "We need to be even more proactive in our outreach to students in these groups because they often have higher rates of depression, anxiety, relationship violence, and suicide." So in essence, these are sometimes programs for at-risk youth. The 4 years spent in college are an important experience for all students. And for the students that are watching today, I'm sure you know that. Your college experience comes at a time in your life where you're growing and discovering yourself. That's especially the case for LGBT youth, who are not only discovering their identity and navigating their relationship with parents and their families, but also hoping to discover their own value. Outreach programs help them to do this. LGBT resource centers, like the large one at Georgetown University, which are still rare, are an even better idea. And objections to gay-straight alliances, outreach programs, and resource programs are almost always off the mark. Simply by comparing them to other programs, you show up the double standard, right? They promote sexual activity? No, they don't. Besides, you could argue that so do co-ed dorms, and no one has a problem with that. They promote rowdy behavior? No, they don't. You could argue that football games and basketball games do the same thing. So be creative with programs designed to welcome. One college sponsors an LGBTQIA plus mixer with faculty, students, and staff, including allies. Another school has a lavender graduation where LGBT faculty and staff wear purple stoles over their academic regalia. So this just to be creative, knowing your own school, your location, the diocese, the bishop, all sorts of things that go into trying to discern what are good outreach programs for this population. 4, in terms of best practices, bring together the entire school. The whole school really needs to come together on an issue that is often seen. This is an important point that was raised by a lot of people I spoke with, that is often seen as just the province, just the sort of responsibility of campus ministry or the counseling center. Khadijah's story shows how well things can work when the entire school understands the unique needs of its LGBT members. One dean said to me, no one part of the institution, like an LGBTQ center, can meet the needs of LGBTQ students. Training is necessary for people in all areas of the school: academic advising, student health, counseling and psychological services, campus ministry, resident life, athletics. Also, bringing together the whole school and building relationships right around this issue makes it easier to communicate during times of crisis over, the inevitable hot button LGBTQ issues. So can your whole school, wherever you are, Sacred Heart or any Catholic institution, be a place where LGBT people feel loved? To answer that, you might ask yourself a question. Would they feel comfortable coming out at your school? Often, an LGBT faculty member is the first one to whom a student may come out. Now, this changes a bit. I mean, even this talk is a year. I was the data that I sort of was gathering was like a year or two ago when I was working on this talk. And I think many more kids are coming out in high school, but still, there are a lot of college kids that come out, at that time in their life. But faculty members may be unconnected to other professional staffs like counseling, psychiatric services, and campus ministry. Faculty, said a former president of a large university, and I haven't worked in higher ed, so I think this was interesting, are more likely than other student-centered professionals to assume the church has a blanket condemnation of these students. Okay? So does the top administration in your school signal to the entire school that the position of the church is pastoral accompaniment? More fundamentally, can your school be a place where LGBT people feel safe? Right? That's essential. That's just essential. One former president of, and that goes for all students, of course, especially minorities of any sort, including, LGBT kids. One former president of a college in the Northeast said, priority always has to be given to the safety and well-being of the students. I found this quote very moving. If a gay or trans student were attacked, I would never want anything I said to have given encouragement to the attackers, even unintentionally, by criticizing gay or trans students, their lifestyle, or their activity. 5, in terms of best practices, remember that words matter. When building bridges, many people tend to think that, it's the actions that matter, but words and signs and symbols matter. Many people tend to see LGBT issues as political matters, weapons in what is called sometimes identity politics. The words we use, pronouns, for example, or more broadly, the way we talk about LGBT people in the Catholic world often turns into a battle. You can still be criticized, believe it or not, even for using the term LGBT, right? But for the LGBT person, these issues are something entirely different. One student wrote in Notre Dame's newspaper, her name is Maddie Foley. I think this is really beautiful. Please, in the name of gentleness and mercy, if you are still opposed to LGBTQ plus inclusion in the church, choose your words carefully and remember that there are real, complicated, dignified, made in the image of God people hearing them. People you haven't witnessed in prayer, people that have been wounded by the church, people that love God, people who have wept and wept about their place in God's kingdom, people who will be far more affected by your words about gay rights than you will ever be. So questions about words, terms, phrases, and even the way we discuss these issues have real life impacts beyond some imaginary political agenda, right? As an aside, LGBT students come from a wide variety of backgrounds, right? In Sacred Heart and elsewhere. Many have left the Catholic Church because they feel rejected or have never thought of the church as a home at all. Some may be comfortable with their own sexuality and see no contradiction between their belief and sexuality, whether or not they follow church teaching on chastity. You could make the same observation about sexually active straight students, too. These LGBT youth are happy in campus ministry, at Mass, and in the church. Still others are wrestling with church teaching. Finally, many struggle with what one theologian termed Christophobia, the fear of Christ and the church brought on by generations of hatred and homophobia. So self-loathing is a real issue. Beyond words, what signs and symbols show them that they are loved in the school? How about LGBT affirming spiritualities, theologies, liturgies, and safe places? Are LGBT people fully welcome at Mass, and do they feel fully welcome? Remember, speaking of the Catholic intellectual tradition, a little Latin, lex orandi, lex credendi. How we worship shapes and shows what we believe. How we study does as well. Are their experiences part of what they study? Right? Are they brought into the schools and the classroom as well? Sixth, in terms of best practices and building bridges, we have to stand with them. Money issues and fear are always poor excuses not to stand with the marginalized, right? I hope you know that from your Catholic intellectual tradition, and particularly not only Catholic social teaching, but Jesus's own ministry. There is an even more severe cost of not standing with LGBT people: suicide, depression, loss of community, loss of faith. It would be the same with students of any minority. And finally, firing married LGBT faculty is clearly not standing with the LGBT person. Now, the reason usually given for firings is that these employees are not supporting or conveying church teaching. That's actually a quote from an archbishop in the United States. But you could say the same for many Catholics, those who use birth control, those who don't attend Sunday Mass, for example. You could also say it about those people who aren't Catholic. Will you fire the Protestant employee who doesn't believe in papal teachings, or the Jewish employee who doesn't believe in Jesus? I'm not suggesting we do. I'm just saying that targeting married LGBT employees is not enforcing church teaching because you're enforcing it selectively. Rather, it is engaging in discrimination. So even if it costs, stand with them. Be prophetic. Be like Jesus. Because if we're not trying to be like Jesus, then what's the point? And another best practice: educate yourself and your school. The kind of education that occurs around LGBT issues is multifaceted. The best education to begin with is simply listening to the experiences of LGBTQ people. How can you build a bridge if you don't know what the other person is interested in or what the other person's experiences are? So you have to start with listening. If we start with experience, it will help to inform all else: ethics, spirituality, theology, and so on. Second, we need to educate ourselves about the full range of church teaching about LGBT people. Even educated and devout Catholics tend to think that the Catechism includes simply a restriction on same-sex marriage and same-sex relation, which it does, but there's also the invitation to treat them with respect, compassion, and sensitivity, and the restriction against unjust discrimination. But even this is too narrow. Church teaching on LGBT people is more than a few lines in the Catechism. Church teaching, fundamentally, is the gospel and Jesus' message of love, mercy, and inclusion, especially for those on the margins. That is the heart of church teaching. Jesus, is the heart of church teaching. He is the Sacred Heart of church teaching. Speaking of church teaching, I want to say that there's a great deal you can read about on your own about topics that are still confusing, right? In terms of church teaching and sexuality issues. I think it's important to do educating yourself on your own, right? Outside what you might learn in school. Finally, I would suggest offering education programs for the whole university, safe zone or what are called Q advocacy workshops or opportunities for students, faculty, and the community to learn more about sexuality and gender issues. And they often help people set and clarify vocabulary in LGBT issues. They provide lectures or activities that serve as a space for discussion on issues of bias and identity. They offer opportunities for people simply to ask questions, and they empower people to feel involved in issues that face an increasing number of students, faculty, and administration. So let your college be even more of a place of learning, right, on this complicated topic. Listen, another best practice, listen to transgender people in humility. Okay, so transgender people and how the church reaches out to them is a real leading edge in terms of LGBT issues in Catholic higher education. And I am no expert, but few people are, including psychiatrists and psychologists. The medical, scientific, and psychological data about this phenomenon are complex. We're all learners, so we should all be listeners, right? We should all be listeners. In 2019, you heard professors saying that I met with the Pope to talk about LGBT issues, which I did. It was one of the highlights of my life. At the next day, I was invited to discuss transgender students with the Vatican's Congregation for Catholic Education after they published the document called Male and Female, He Created Them. So during the meeting, I read out from letters from a Catholic sister who works with trans people, from a transgender man, and from the mother and father with LGBT, a letter from a mother and father of LGBT. I'm sorry. And I read a letter from a mother and father who have LGBT kids. And I also read a letter from a transgender man. So what the congregation said, and they said I could say this publicly, said that they expressed sorrow if people thought the congregation was accusing people of being ideologically distorted. And the head of the congregation wanted to share the Vatican's care for transgender people and his desire for continued dialogue to help us reflect on this phenomenon. And finally, I would say, in terms of best practices, during a crisis, discern and make a preferential option for the LGBT person. Now, I'm sure you know that from your Catholic intellectual tradition, the preferential option for the poor, but it's also the preferential option for the marginalized, for the person who feels left out. So in a crisis, right, and there are plenty of crises that come up over this issue, I would say there are three things to begin with. First, colleges should avoid boilerplate responses to hot button topics. Okay, find out what's going on. And recognize that attacks about LGBT issues, especially from the outside, are often attacks on other things. Higher education, some political party, the 1960s, Vatican II, or even Pope Francis. And some topics seem to naturally invite or incite controversy. All right, so I asked some Catholic education leaders what would be some good responses to crisis management on LGBT issues. Well, first they said, keep the diocesan bishop, your local ordinary, informed, right? Second, maybe approach these things from an educational point of view. Can you have a panel or a presentation on, for example, the question of drag shows, if that comes up, or why gender neutral bathrooms have become so important? Those are two kind of hot button topics. I also mentioned bringing in the stories of LGBT people and LGBT history into history classes. So fostering an environment like that at a school like Sacred Heart, where the LGBT experience is integrated into the curriculum, much like other topics that are important are integrated into the curriculum, helps the entire school in times of controversy because the school already sees those topics in a larger context. Finally, discern, right? When we're talking about building bridges in the Catholic Church with the LGBT person, right, more broadly, and also when we're talking about building a bridge within Catholic higher education, within Catholic colleges and universities, also Catholic high schools and Catholic parishes, we have to remember that no one size fits all. Okay, so what works in one university may not work exactly in another university. You have different sort of traditions, right? I mean, you have different backgrounds, you have different locales, you're in different dioceses, the sort of cultural makeup of the school is different, right? So trust that God will lead you to the best decision, which is based, again, on your school, your history, your mission, your student body, your diocese, and your bishop. But all else being the same, make a preferential option for those who have few on their side in the church, the LGBTQ person. Thanks very much. Now I'm looking forward to your questions.
And thank you so much, Father Martin, for an engaging talk. I know that we still have a lot to think about here at Sacred Heart, as many other college campuses do, as we think about creating communities of inclusivity and welcoming on campus. So thanks for kickstarting this conversation. We also have to kickstart our question and answer session. And if you haven't written down your questions, please do submit them on YouTube, and we will hopefully get to all of them today. But just to kickstart our conversation, we have a question from our college president, Dr. John Patillo, who says, Jim, have you seen where the local bishops marked the colleges as less than Catholic because the college recognizes, sponsors, and supports LGBTQ events? If so, should the college stand firm in its welcoming and beliefs?
Wow, that's a hard question. And I would think that your president probably has more experience with that than I do. Well, I think that the wisdom that I had heard from a lot of college presidents, and I'm speaking to your president right now. The wisdom I've heard is basically to always keep your ordinary informed, right? They don't like to be surprised, as you probably know. But I think that all else being the same, I think advocating and standing by the LGBT person in those situations is really important, or the faculty member, right? Because I think that oftentimes the LGBT person really has no one to advocate for himself or herself or themselves, right? With the institutional church. So I think it's important to, as I said, to make a preferential option, but also obviously respecting the bishop's authority. And usually in these situations, I found that what really makes it difficult is when these things are made public, right? And I have to say, I mean, I've heard from friends in the Vatican that it makes it more difficult sometimes for the Vatican to do something, right? So I think oftentimes dealing with these things ahead of time, keeping your bishop informed about all these things, soliciting his advice, obviously, is paramount, which I'm sure you already do. But by the same token, I think really making a preferential option for these people who really are sometimes treated like dirt in the church. I just today, I heard the story of a man who was gay and worked for a parish. Someone this is going to sound made up, but believe it or not, someone took a secret video of him. They went up to his house and asked about, is this a welcoming place for gay people? And they used that video against him, so there's lots of attacks going on. And I think we need to stand firm, in our support for people who are really on the margins.
Thanks so much. We also have another question from Mary Woodhouse, and she's asking, what guidance can you give a person like me whose son left the Catholic Church because he worried of being treated like a sinner?
Yeah, I would just say, Mary, that, for him, you are the Catholic Church right now, right? I mean, he is, I assume he's baptized and he's still Catholic, right? And he's decided not to go to church. But, he is still Catholic, and the sort of the kind of connection, the bridge, if you will, between him and his suspicion and the church is you, right? I mean, so part of it's mainly dealing with him with love. I think that's a really important thing. I think on a practical level, it might be pointing out places where where LGBTQ people are welcome, right? I mean, to make a funny joke, I hope it's funny. You can give them a copy of my book, for example. You can talk to them about some of the amazing things that are happening in the church. For example, just this past month, the Tyler Clementi Foundation, which works against LGBTQ bullying, worked with several Catholic bishops, 12 Catholic bishops, to put out a statement against LGBTQ bullying. And since then, many religious orders and Catholic institutions have signed on. So you can point to things that are sort of steps forward for him to help him feel less alone and less, targeted. And finally, I think, part of it is helping him identify LGBT friendly parishes where he does feel welcome. The whole thing about him being a sinner, look, we're all sinners, right? We're talking on Ash Wednesday, right? There's no one in this church community who does not sin in one way. But to have one group of people pointed out as the most sinful or the chief sinners is just crazy. Look, I'm a sinner, and So is everybody on this call, right? And so to target people in that way is really unfair. So I think there are places and parishes where he can feel welcome, which I think is a really wonderful step forward. On a more super practical level, if you go to New Ways Ministry, that's a Catholic ministry organization that helps and advocates for LGBTQ people, you'll see a whole list of LGBTQ friendly parishes, which might be a good place for him to start.
So this question kind of asks you to look into the future as if you can, but this is from Jason Taylor, and he asks, do you think the church will ever support same-sex marriage?
Well, it's an interesting question because you'll notice that there has been some movement, particularly in Germany and Western Europe, for blessing same-sex marriages, right? And Pope Francis, for example, has talked about supporting legal protections for same-sex couples. He said that a couple of months ago in a documentary, and everybody went crazy. It was, I think, literally front page news on the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he meant it. He had said that recently. So in terms of actually sacramental same-sex marriages, I think that's doubtful. I don't know if that will ever happen because of the church's understanding of marriage. But what might it mean for the church to bless, as a bishop said just 2 days ago, I think, in Germany? What would it mean for the church to bless same-sex unions? It's an interesting and open question right now, and I think it's something that that many church leaders are talking about more openly. So we'll see where that goes.
Thanks. And we have another question from Kayla, who's wondering, truly, what is the most important thing you want your listeners to take away from this talk today?
What a great question. I think that that we need to listen to the experiences of LGBT people in the church and outside the church. The church has to listen to them. You know, you think about the stories of Jesus encountering people, right? One of my favorite stories, and I put this in the book Building a Bridge, is the woman at the well, also called the Samaritan woman. It's in John's Gospel. And basically, Jesus comes across a woman who is getting water at a well. She's from Samaria, which, you know, the Jewish people and the Samaritans didn't get along very well. So she's already kind of excluded. And she's getting water at 12 noon. And you would say, well, why would they even mention that? Well, it's because it's at the heat of the day. And she's a little embarrassed, and she's not getting it when the other women get it, which is in the morning. And Jesus meets her, and it turns out she's been married 5 times. And I think the text implies that she's living with someone else right now. So very much considered someone on the outside, okay? And we can see LGBT people who feel like they're marginalized or pushed out of the church like that. And what does Jesus do? Does he condemn her? Does he tell her what a terrible person she is? No, he listens to her, right? He listens to her, listens carefully. They have a conversation, okay? And through that, he comes to know her. So I think that's one of the things that the church needs to do with LGBT people, come to know their experiences, you know, because if all you do is issue documents and send out condemnations and write tweets and publish and preach homilies about LGBT people, if you don't know them, is, you know, it's pretty ignorant, right? I mean, imagine if I were giving a talk about, let's just pick something that's kind of more neutral. If I were giving a talk about the Catholic intellectual tradition program at Sacred Heart, okay, and I did no research, you know, I just did it off the top of my head. This is what I think it should be. If I did no research, and if I didn't talk to the students and faculty and the alumni, right, and the president in terms of what his vision was for that, I couldn't say anything intelligent. But unfortunately, a lot of times with LGBT people, that's what the church does. It doesn't listen. So I think that the most important thing that I would want people to take away from this talk is that for the church to build a bridge to the LGBT community, it first has to listen in humility and also be open to learning in humility.
This question comes from Sean, who says, many students are fearful of what repercussions may come when advocating for LGBTQ rights on campus. Is this fear justified? And what advice would you give them?
Well, I would say that, look, because we're having this talk, sponsored by Sacred Heart, and, your president is on this talk, and I've spoken at the university. And, there were a lot of protests when I spoke at the university, not from within the university, but, from people who were in the area. And the university really stood up for that talk. I remember that very well. Your president and the faculty and the administration were very bold and very courageous. So I would say, I hope that you feel welcome, and I hope you feel welcome in a place that has a great tradition of, Catholic social teaching and the Gospels, of course, but also of, academic freedom and the ability to speak your mind. So I would say, speak boldly, right? And also recognize the Catholic tradition and Catholic teaching. So I think students should feel. I would say this. Look, I feel that students feel at home with those issues at Sacred Heart. And actually, what would you say, Professor? Do you think a student would be should feel at home, sort of speaking his or her or their minds?
Absolutely. I think it's right in the mission, is caring for the dignity of every person, which you highlighted already in your talk, and building a more just society, which are things that we think about in our CIT classes every day. So I think you should feel welcomed and encouraged, and know that there are resources on campus if you'd like to participate and get involved in these kinds of questions, especially within the church. Um, the campus ministry office, I know, is very open to these things as well. So yeah, I would feel welcomed and accept the charge to be that person who's a good Catholic ally, who's going to build that more inclusive culture on our campus. Be that person.
Yeah, and I would say, the person's name is Sean. Is that right? I would say, Sean, as you're hearing, you may be called to do that, right? I mean, you may be someone who is, if you're a member of the LGBTQ community or if you're an ally, if you think about the different calls we have and the different vocations we have, I mean, how else can we build a more just society other than by listening to those desires within us? I talk about this in my book on prayer. By trusting that the desires we have for justice and for compassion for people who are on the margins are coming from God, right? And to speak those out, and also to be respectful of other voices too, right? To be able to dialogue with other voices and listen to other voices, and but be firm in what you believe and in your convictions.
So we have more questions. We have another question who comes from someone who's asking, if a gay man feels called to the priesthood, what advice would you have for him?
Well, that's a great question. There are many gay men who are priests and members of religious orders. Let me be clear: they're celibate or they're chaste in religious orders. There are many lesbians. There's a book out about lesbian nuns that just was published recently who are following their own vows of chastity. Excuse me. And so we have to say that gay priests and lesbian sisters and gay brothers in religious orders are following the same rules and guidelines and lives as their straight counterparts are. I'm a Jesuit and I'm a priest. I live my vows of poverty and chastity and obedience, right? I'm also a priest who has a promise of celibacy on top of the chastity. I live in community, and there are gay Jesuits and straight Jesuits, and it's just about being faithful. And I think that's always been the case, right? That's really always been the case, and it always will be the case. And I think it's beautiful that God has called, gay men and lesbians to the religious life and the priesthood, right? I think that's always been the case. So I would trust that call, right? And there's some people who sometimes misunderstand it. It really is confusing to me. I mean, it's pretty simple, right? If you're a gay man, you live celibacy or chastity as a priest. I mean, I don't know how much more simple it could be than that. And people still have a problem with it, right? Because they say, they have the stereotype is, oh, if you're gay, you're obviously sexually active, or you have to be sexually active, which is baloney. So yeah, I would trust the call, right? I mean, that call is really holy and really reverence it. So listen to it and explore places, right, where you feel welcome, right? Or explore places. You might consider the Jesuits while you're at it.
I love that you put in your own plug there, Father Martin, for
Oh,
your
sure.
order.
Why not?
Um, so we have another great question from Sean, which is, what would you say to people who do not advocate for the LGBTQ community, because it's, quote, not their battle, because these issues don't concern them.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, let me think how I want to answer that, because I think we should all be concerned with anybody who is on the margins, anybody who is struggling. Okay, whether that is LGBT people, refugees and migrants, the unborn, people who are poor, homeless. There's so many different categories of people and individuals, who are struggling. So, as Christians, we want to be compassionate and particularly um, sort of seeking out these people like Jesus did, right? I mean, Jesus went primarily to the people who were struggling. Those are the people he was working with. So we should be open to the needs of all people. At the same time, not everybody can work in the same way for every group, right? So I would never say to someone who is working with refugees and migrants, right, in a refugee camp. I worked with refugees in East Africa. I would never say, why aren't you working with homeless people? Well, okay. Or why aren't you working with LGBT people? It's like, well, okay, this is my particular ministry, right? So I don't think we can say that, everyone can have the same level of advocacy for every topic, right? But by the same token, I think that each of us should have those people within our care, right? So if we talk about the person who's working in the refugee camp, the person might say, oh, my primary work is with refugees, but I do know that there are LGBT people, and I know there are LGBT people in refugee camps, which is actually a big issue. Or I pray for them, or I do this. So it's kind of a balance. It's a balance, I think. I think we're called all to keep the needs of all the people on the margins in our minds and in our hearts, and try to work for them as much as we can. But by the same token, there are certain people who do certain ministries that are focused on one group of people. To use a silly analogy, if you're an oncologist, a cancer doctor, you would never say, oh, why don't you take care of people who have broken legs? That's a problem too, right? So, the doctor obviously cares about those people, but different people choose different things. But the doctor would also never say, I don't care about people who have broken legs. So it's kind of a little bit of a balance there, I would say.
I think that makes a lot of sense, actually, that we all sort of have our call to particular ministries. But if you're thinking about this, maybe that's something you should explore as well. One of my own questions, selfishly, I'm going to ask is, you mentioned in your talk sort of how Catholics have been part of the religious persecution of the LGBTQ community, but also that we should be caring for the LGBTQ community because we are Catholic, right? So I'm wondering, sort of, how can we sort of change the discourse around the Catholic discourse around this kind of issue, where it's not so polarized? Like, how can I, as a Catholic ally, be a part of changing the conversation so that people are more aware that there are these rich resources in the tradition that actually call us to be more inclusive?
Well, I think one thing to do would be, from your position, but I think for all of our positions, is to do just that, is to sort of draw attention to the resources, right? To the teachings. I think also using the Gospels and using Jesus and pointing out how he worked with people on the margins, right? Sometimes it's intellectual arguments that works, like pointing out the kind of double standard of the way that we treat LGBT people as sinners, when we're all sinners, right? People who are fired because they're not, as I said, supporting or conveying church teaching, when we have plenty of people in our Catholic institutions who don't do that. So sometimes it's an intellectual thing. So the first thing is pointing to resources like the Gospels, obviously, and Catholic social teaching. The second thing is kind of using, I would say, insights to help people. But a third is also really raising up the voices of LGBT people. I think really nothing changes and converts people's hearts more than stories, right? So to be able to tell the stories of people who are, amazing Catholic parishioners and educators and philanthropists and lay people, who are really helping the church a lot. So, and I also think finally maybe finding common ground. So, for example, I've been helping, as I said, the Tyler Clementi Foundation that does such amazing work. And the common ground that they have found with bishops is against LGBTQ bullying, harassment, and violence, right? And that's a start, sort of building bridges between an LGBTQ advocacy group and the Catholic Church, right? And so I think finding common ground. And I do think violence against LGBTQ people, the decriminalization of of homosexuality, family issues, right? I find that's a good inroad with the church as well, to say, wouldn't you want to take care of families who are struggling because an LGBT son or a daughter is suicidal or is feeling lonely or left out of the church? And usually Catholic leaders say, well, of course I want to help the families and I don't want anyone to feel unwelcome. So part of it's also being creative too. It's a tough question, but I think there are ways to do it. I really do.
Yeah, I just want to follow up. Thank you so much. I think that makes some sense. I want to follow up and sort of push you a little bit. I've been hearing a lot of advocacy for pastoral approaches, and I think that's really important. But I'm wondering how we engage with the LGBTQ community when certain Catholic resources do have gender complementarity or sort of a preference for heterosexuality sort of baked into these religious texts, these sacred texts, right? And I'm not sure they're necessarily a part of the tradition in the same way, right, other things are. But how do we deal with that the tradition is complicated and it does present kind of two or more sides
Well,
to.
I would say that's a great question. I would say the same way you would do it with, for example, women. Like if you were presenting the Catholic history of women, right? I mean, that includes, Adam and Eve and, all the complicated history of women in the Old Testament and then the New Testament. And you would never say this is the way we take things today. We think women should be property of the husband, right? I mean, no one would ever say that. At least I hope they would never say that. You say, well, this is how we have to understand it in tradition. So part of it is contextualizing it. And I think also in particular, in terms of homosexuality and the LGBT person, I think so many verses are taken out of context in scripture in a way that other verses would never be. So, I always say to people, they say, well, look, homosexuality is condemned in Leviticus. So is blasphemy, right? And so is having sex before you're married, right? I mean, a woman could be stoned to death for having sex before they're married. Do you think we should do that today? And they would say, no, of course we shouldn't do that. And I would say, well, why not? That's in the Bible. You're talking about sexual morality. There it is. Well, we think of these things differently now. It's like, yeah, exactly. So part of it is not that we dismiss it. We don't pretend that it's not there, but we have to help people understand what it means in its context then, and also how we understand it now. So that I think that goes with the tradition. You don't ignore it, but I think it's important to help people understand it and also point to other parts of the tradition, right? As well, point to some of the things that Pope Francis has said about LGBTQ people, or that bishops have said, or even this Tyler Clementi document. That's a real step forward that, that probably wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. So I think there's a lot of strides being made.
Absolutely. Well, on that hopeful note, we just want to thank you again for coming to Sacred Heart and for talking to all our viewers, wherever you may be in the world. I know you've given me a lot of hope and hopefully a lot of our viewers on these issues and how we might build bridges to create a more inclusive society. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Great to be back at Sacred Heart. I'm so proud of my being part of the family. And I want to thank everybody who listened today and, just ask you to keep me in your prayers, and more importantly, keep our LGBTQ brothers and sisters and siblings in your prayers as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining tonight's program. To learn more, visit sacredheart.edu.